Hi, I'm Gavin Weir, and it's great to be involved in Curriculum Thinking Week again this year. I'm from King's Academy Ringmer. I'm an assistant principal here in charge of teaching and learning, and I'm here to talk to you about driving 100% participation through the power of Oracy. Now, the context of our school has been that for a number of years, we've been working on getting a really good foundation of compliance with our students, and I believe that we had built a strong base of a sort of culture of compliance going into this year. However, in the past, we've sort of felt that our classrooms have been a bit passive. So our students have, come out of COVID. They've maybe not developed all the skills and attributes that we've had from prior years, and they've been quite passive in our classrooms. So we wanted to combat that, and we wanted to sort of have a war on passivity in our school. Now, why does it matter that we have a war on passivity? Well, we know that if students are passive, that they consolidate their knowledge less well, that they develop their independence more poorly, and that also they don't build that resilience that we want them to have going out into their futures. And as I said, we built up this really strong culture of compliance within the school. So students were, broadly speaking, doing what we asked them to do, but they weren't necessarily participating with the vigor that we wanted them to in our classrooms. And ultimately, what we are aiming to build within our school was this culture of thinking and having 100% participation as a standard, not a goal. And really, it's about belief. It's ultimately what I think is the way of creating the most inclusive classroom where students feel like they belong. And it puts the emphasis on the teacher to remove the barriers to students being able to participate. Now, in terms of the actions that we took, I first looked at a number of different sources. So Teach Like a Champion was influential, for example, the work of Pratesh on Bunsen Blue blog, that was also very influential. And I wanted a clear model that gave staff a way of conceptualizing what I wanted to see within the school that was memorable and that was also simple as well. So it was a simple whole school strategy for how we can think about participation. And I took a sort of mathematical perception of this, taken from Doug Lemov. So with this idea of there being two spectra. So on one axis, we have participation. That's the percentage of students that are thinking at any given time throughout the lesson. And then on the y-axis, we have the thinking ratio. So what proportion of students are thinking about something which is cognitively demanding. So at the top, you would have the most cognitively demanding, and 0 would be they're not really thinking about anything at all. And we end up with these sort of quadrants. So the first quadrant is what I refer to as crickets. So you have a situation where, and this is a term that I sort of embedded, was how many students are on the bus. You've got barely any students who are on the bus who are participating, and what they're participating in is quite low in terms of its cognitive demand. They haven't climbed the cognitive ladder. That's the analogy I was using. We've then got an area above that where you have a higher amount of thinking going on, but it's only happening in a small number of students, and the fastest, the loudest, they dominate these classrooms. We've then got a shallow land where we have more students participating, but they're really not thinking about anything which is particularly cognitively challenging. And then obviously there's the area that we would all want to aim to in our classrooms, where we have this sort of maximal learning zone where 100% of the students are thinking and participating in something 100% of the time. There's lots of learning going on. It's cognitively demanding enough to elicit new neural pathways being formed. But there's this sort of final area as well, which is down here, where you have a lot of the class on the bus, but they're not necessarily thinking about something which is super challenging outside of their zone of proximal development. And in this place, it's quite an alluring destination. And I think sometimes some classrooms which seem really buzzy, remember, sort of engagement is a bit of a poor proxy for learning, but you go into these classrooms, there's a buzz going on, the students are engaged, but not necessarily in something which is super challenging. And that can be a good place to start. So I sort of call it base camp. It's a good place to get to. It's an achievement to get to, but you also want to try and climb the cognitive ladder. It's a temporary destination where you then need to climb up the level of challenge so that all pupils can engage in something which is demanding enough to elicit new neural neural pathways being formed. So now that we have this model, we also need to think about a clear model that everyone can get their head around in terms of what we actually mean by learning. And what I've done here is I've brought together a number of different models of cognition into something that I think encompasses what all teachers should understand about learning in their classrooms. So first of all, there's a sensory input. So there's lots of stuff happening in classrooms all of the time. There's the sound of the person speaking next to them. There's the vision of a bird flying past the door. And there's also what the teacher is wanting them to engage with, so the text or the teacher speaking, for example. There's lots of sensory inputs. And our sensory memory can only take on board a small portion of what's happening around us. It would be overwhelming if we did take on board everything. And any information that's not first attended to, that we pay attention to, is instantly lost. And it's therefore not taken on by the students, even into their short-term memory. So unattended information is lost. That was the first thing I wanted staff to understand. And then the next thing I wanted staff to understand is that we have a limited capacity in our short-term memory. And again, if we don't rehearse things, we can only really take on board a few pieces, sort of 4 to 7 bits of information at a time. So unrehearsed information is lost as well. So there's all these places where the knowledge gets lost or the information gets lost. And then we've got our long-term memory. And when we bring information into our long-term memory, we have a much more unlimited capacity within our long-term memory to encode information. And we can then store it, but it is lost slowly. We know the forgetting curve. It's lost slowly over time as well, unless it's rehearsed, unless it's retrieved. So that's the model that I wanted everyone to think about. And then, well, what do we think about then? Well, we then think about how do we maximize the attention on what we want them to pay attention to? How do we maintain that attention? How do we give them opportunities to rehearse? And then how do we support them with encoding that information and then retrieving it at different points in the future? And I think a lot of people kind of understand this process. I just wanted to lay it out clearly for all staff. Now, what I decided in the end was that, well, there's a lot of different ways of getting things wrong, and there's a small number of ways of getting things right. So I wanted to find out what were the really core techniques that are going to support us with this challenge of the thinking ratio and the participation ratio. And could staff then get much better at that small number of techniques and us therefore have quite a big impact within a short space of time? So all of the techniques that I chose, I decided must maintain attention, allow rehearsal for students, and support with retrieval, so that we're hitting all three of those parts of the cognitive process. Secondly, the principle of there are more ways of getting things wrong than there are of getting things right. So there's only a small number of ways to get things right. So having these core strategies that we define and we then practice as a school is a helpful way to get over that problem. Third, I want to make sure that we're not wasting time with teaching students different routines in each classroom, because that just wastes learning time. Number 4, I wanted them to be used consistently well. So simple things done consistently well is better than the occasional performative act which is done really well. So consistency and simplicity are often key. And 5th, I wanted it to reduce teacher workload. So I don't want to create strategies that are then going to take time away from my teachers being, active in their classroom, prepared, and also as well energized when they go in. So I came up with this idea of let's hit those 3 areas. Let's hit the attention, let's hit the retrieval, and let's hit the rehearsal as well. So first of all, how do we get all students on the bus at our school? Well, we have to gain 100% attention, and we have to maintain that as a standard, not a goal. And there's a few key strategies that we picked. So this idea of checks for listening is about getting all the students to that base camp. So getting them to make sure that they've understood what you've said or what you've presented to them. And massively increasing the frequency of that questioning is a way to do that. So the questions at the start could be quite simple. Just retrieving and making sure that they know what you've said and saying it back to you. It also encourages oracy as well. So things like core response or I say, you say are really good techniques to maintain and gain attention. So frequent questioning and use of core response have really helped for our checks for listening. And then secondly, for rehearsal. Now, how do we think about rehearsal? Again, this is from Pratesh. So he thinks about rehearsal as building understanding, stopping that information that's in your short-term memory from being lost. Unrehearsed information is lost. So any task that generates new thought is a good task for rehearsal. So sequencing, ordering, these are good tasks for rehearsing. As is turn and talk, so giving the students an opportunity to talk to the person next to them. Turn and talk can also be a good strategy as well to maintain attention, because it gives students an opportunity to think about and to talk about their ideas before they're then shared as a class. And then finally, how do we get students to cement their understanding by asking them to retrieve it? Well, really, that's about checks for understanding. And obviously, there are a huge number of ways in which we can check for understanding. But the key thing I've been looking for is that those checks for understanding then dictate the direction of the lesson. So it could be that you can move on because all of the students, when you've done 100%, a check for understanding that checks 100% of their understandings, it could be that you could move on. You might decide that enough of the students have mastered that concept. But it could also be that you need to go back to a different part of the cognitive process. Maybe none of them have really understood it at all. You might need to go back and regain their attention and give them some more direct instruction. It might be that they need just a bit more of an opportunity to rehearse. It might be that they just need more opportunity to retrieve or talk about their ideas before you then move on. So ensuring that we have these sort of signposts throughout our lesson, and it dictates where the lesson goes. Now, what's the impact of this been? Now, obviously, I've given you quite a big overview of what we've been doing today, and there are individual techniques within that we've really worked on. Well, first of all, the staff have told us that since the start of the year, if we ask them the question, do 100% of my students participate in my lessons? Well, that rose from about a quarter of our staff to 80%. So from 25% to 80% in 5 terms. So that's really good. That's positive. Our students also tell us something similar. So when we asked our students at the start of the year, the proportion of them that were asked to speak in any given in a lesson within the last 24 hours, that rose from 18% to 93%. So we're hearing from our students more often and in a structured way. Ofsted as well praised the efforts. We had them a few terms ago, and particularly they praised how that supported the SEND students and the students that require additional support with their reading, because they're given more opportunities to participate within lessons, and we're removing more of those barriers. That's the focus of the staff member, making our teaching simpler but more effective. That's allowed them to have really good support, and they're achieving well. It's creating more of an inclusive environment for them. That's what they say. And also our Progress 8 score as well. So last year, especially our pupil premium students who were at risk of disadvantage, they performed in the top 100 schools nationally. Now, as I said, this is only a small overview of some of the strategies and thinking that we've been doing this year. So I've put in 4 really fundamental things that I've based some of these ideas on to share with you. So one of them is the principle of 100% by that's mentioned in Teach Like a Champion, as well as that participation ratio. One of them is from Bunsen Blue's blog about the 3 phases of questioning that I discussed. And then the whole brain approach to learning. So the idea of things being generative and the idea of think it, say it, teach it, which supports students with gaining a much larger amount of content. And finally, turn and talk as well, that I alluded to, that there's a really good blog by Pritesh on that. So thank you for listening today, guys. Please engage in the comments, ask me any questions. I'll share some training resources as well that I've used with my staff for this. And if you would like to come and visit the school, then please do get in touch. Thank you.